Our SEO expert says we have to use 3 words for title slides, and here we've used diversity damages shareholders, and you're probably looking at that with a fair degree of alarm because many people have been told that diversity is good, and indeed it is. So it's very important that we immediately start putting this into context, what we mean by diversity. So in the workplace, diversity is often referred to with the acronym DEI. This stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're going to want to start by going through those words. And this is all part of a much broader environmental social governance framework that is now being, let's say, imposed onto companies. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this presentation, because we haven't seen anybody talking about the dangers of DEI in the workplace. We do all the time, and that's brought about some questions and thus this presentation. So the DEI group is typically an extension of human resources, and we want to start by talking about the word diversity of those 3 words, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the 3 dimensions of diversity that the DEI folks like to focus on are gender, race, and sexuality, whereas there are a lot more ways to slice and dice a population that you might argue are more important, such as religion or the caste system. You can see here that in India, there's a rigid caste where you're born into your social standing and you're not mobile. So you would think that's probably the low-hanging fruit, the first place that the DEI folks ought to go poking around, but I've never heard one of them talk about this. Education, so we should look at people with no education, some education. The best education is the worst. Attractiveness, critically important, that a factor that's often overlooked when it comes to success. Attractive people are treated differently. That's life. That's how things go. And you can start to look at things like height. Being a tall gentleman myself, I can tell you that's very important in the dating world. Weight, equally important on both sides. Although if you are male and heavy, as long as you have the resources, that isn't so important. The appeal of your face, again, attractiveness. But why not look at eye color, hair color, and other features? So you can see that diversity is rather complex, and the DEI folks want to make it simple by just examining those 3 factors, gender, race, and sexuality. Speaking of which, here's a great cartoon that Scott Adams is being lambasted for. That's quite humorous, and this is exactly how things work. So they're asking this gentleman to identify as gay, which brings up the bi problem. So you'll see the LGBTQ folks talking about representation. Well, it's rather a gray area when you start talking about bisexuality. So what are the requirements? So if someone gets a hand job after a Dave Matthews concert from some old queen while he's thinking about his girlfriend, is that individual bi? I don't know. Is there a maintenance required once you've ascribed that status to yourself? Can you lose the status? Now, these are questions that are a running theme in the DEI world, where nothing can actually be approached objectively. Everything becomes subjective, and the problems can never be solved. Getting on to the word equity, the problem with equity, I took this from Harvard Business School. They say equity is different than equality, and they're striving to eliminate barriers and overcome past inequities. Well, one might wonder where we stop. And this last sentence here, this is where you should show the DEI folks the door if they ever say something like this. I would give the tallest person, the tallest people, the shortest ladder, and the shortest people, the tallest ladder, so everyone can reach the same height. Bullshit. You do not start offering preferential treatment based on factors other than competency, because that is discrimination, and discrimination is illegal. So when the conversation steers towards equity, that's a huge red flag. Everybody is entitled to equality of opportunity. As a hiring manager, you want every single possible person looked at and scrutinized. The outcome is irrelevant. That is what it is. Equality of opportunity, yes. Equality of outcome, no. So how the DEI departments measure racial diversity is typically using charts like these, where they break everybody down into these handy buckets: Asian, Black, Latino, white, colors, very simple. Well, the problem is much more complex than they want you to believe. And this brings us to the benchmark problem. What's the ideal composition of a diverse team? Well, if we look at the global level, and that's what we've done here on the left-hand side, we've taken a table of the most populated countries, and out of 100 employees, here's how 70 of them ought to look. So you should have 18 Chinese, 18 Indians, 4 people from the US, 4 people from Indonesia, 3 from Pakistan, and the list goes on. That's if you're doing it at a global level. One could argue that's the optimal configuration for a diverse team. But what about at the regional level? So then you would have to do this same exercise in Europe, breaking down people. Well, what about the sub-regional level? So if you're a hiring manager in London, should the ideal benchmark be based on UK population? Should it be based on the country, England, their population breakdown? What about the city of London? Is that where it ought to be based? Well, ideally, you should go down to the university level, because that's the eligible candidates, and then take a look at that population, and that racial breakdown is ideal. And then you need to do that by function and by department. You see how pointless this stuff becomes? This is busy work for incompetent people that can't add value in any other department in an organization. It's impossible to target whatever arbitrary targets are being set. Talk about the Asian problem. This is perhaps one of the most hypocritical things coming from the DEI folks. They want to take 59%, nearly 60% of the world's population, and classify them as Asians. Have they ever been to Asia? This is what Asia looks like on the right-hand side here. You have Southern Asia, Eastern Asia, Western Asia, Central Asia. These are all places with people who are extremely unique and diverse. Even within a single country, you can have multiple different types of extremely diverse viewpoints, thoughts, cultures, subcultures. This is what Asia looks like. So it's not taking a look at the picture of a team fun outing and seeing how many people have olive eyes. That's not what Asians are about. And you'll notice that for some reason, firms don't classify, let's say some firms, all their offshoring that's taking place in India. What do they think Indians are? They're Asians. Well, they're not really Asians. Well, yes, they are Asians. And that's why this thing is so stupid, because this category paints a broad brush. It does a disservice to all these wonderfully rich countries with people who all have different cultures and different viewpoints. So that's probably a good time to talk a little bit about myself. So my diversity exposure: I've worked, lived, and achieved a degree on 3 continents. So this is a bit outdated. I've been to nearly 120 countries now. This is a picture of me shaking hands with I think he's a colonel perhaps, in North Korea. We're on the DMZ on the North Korean side, whereas most people visit the South Korean side. And North Korea is a fascinating place to visit. It's nothing like what you're told, and it's a story in itself. But my workplace hiring exposure is much more relevant to this conversation. So I networked my way into a top 5 investment bank by going to London every weekend, spending thousands of dollars on pounds, as it were, on train tickets and fancy suits and networking and shaking hands. And I made my way into the C-level at Morgan Stanley, and I managed to secure myself an internship. And from that internship, I managed to secure a job. And 3 months into my first job, I became a hiring manager. And over the following decade, my job was to build high-performing teams on 3 different continents and across 7 countries. So I've been a hiring manager for a decade and have a great deal of experience in hiring competent people. So in London, when I first started out hiring, I'll give you an example of how the process works at an extremely selective organization. We were hiring for entry-level associates or senior associates, typically somebody with 4 years experience. My ideal candidate was somebody who exited from an investment bank associate program without an offer, because those programs are extremely difficult to get into. You're talking about 1-2% selectivity, probably lower than that. We liked graduates from top universities in finance, economics, physics, math, the hard sciences, possibly engineering, though I don't know we ever hired anybody with an engineering degree. Regularly rejected candidates from top schools. Just because you went from a top school or you got to go to a top school doesn't mean you're competent at all, and hiring managers will tell you the same. Our interview process was 3 layers. The first layer was myself. If I liked the candidate, I would push them to another VP, and we'd have another PP that would give you 3 opinions. If 2 people shared the same opinion, they would override the third. But most of the time when we found somebody competent, all 3 of us agreed, yeah, this person needs to proceed to the second round. So in the second round, not the third round here, they would go at ED level, executive directors. The last round would be with the managing director, kind of the head honcho in the office. That process resulted in a team that may or may not look like the United Colors of Benetton. And in fact, it actually did, because London was quite a diverse place. Now, where diversity didn't exist is when I started hiring in Mumbai. Lots of Indians there, and that's all you would be able to hire. Say Asians, a huge population of Asians. And my Mumbai experience was over quite a few years, and shortly before I left my role at my previous job where I'd worked for a decade, I was asked to head up our Mumbai office, and I spent some time there. And my first question was, well, how many people from around the world are in this office? They said, well, we have one guy who's not an Indian, and he was a Filipino lad. And I took him into the conference room. So what do you think about this? He said, man, whatever you do, don't move here. And I was like, wow, coming from Manila to Mumbai and not liking it that much. And I can see why. I wouldn't have accepted that role for 3 times what I was making. It's just not a very nice place to work. That's the reality. So when you're hiring in Mumbai, what racial composition are we supposed to shoot for? Is suddenly DEI not important? It sure seems like it, because that's all you're going to hire in Mumbai and in India in general. I also hired in other places such as Manila. We had a big shop there. China, mainland Beijing, Hong Kong, where I was situated and where I took on a team when I moved there. Hiring in the Philippines is very difficult. Ratio of CVs to actual hires is astronomically higher than other places. That's reality. Any hiring manager that works there will say the same exact thing. Filipinas versus Filipinos. People don't like to talk about this stuff, but we did because we had to. Filipinos that's the males in the Philippines are generally not as competent as the females, and you'll end up with an office that's largely consisting of females. That's how things are in the Philippines. It's not our problem to figure out why and to solve it. That we're hiring competent people to build high-performing teams. Hiring in China, all Chinese. That's all you're going to get. And the end result, the outcome. So we built high-performing teams across this planet. Not all those geographies are equally talented. That's how it goes. After we got done building a high-performing team, we could give 2 shits about the race, gender, or sexuality of team members. Irrelevant. Talent and competency are recognized similarly by most races and cultures. That's what I learned over 10 years. When you're competent, you stand out and people recognize that. I took a quick look before this presentation to see how many of the original people that I had hired in London had advanced themselves in that firm. And just a quick look, I saw 3 EDs. So that means they went quite high in the organization, people that I hired from Belgium, India, and Zimbabwe. Again, when I was hiring, I could care less about these people other than their competency. Could they perform? And we built very, very high performing teams. When I left my job, we ran the numbers and our department had doubled output and reduced cost by half. That's remarkable. So it was very difficult to do what we did. Now, when we talk about hiring for high-performing teams, equality of opportunity is a must. Everyone gets a run at it, starting with the initial expression of interest. We want every single CV we can get our hands on, right? Now, that means that you're going to have a lot of CVs. So screening 10,000 CVs requires objective rules. I'm sorry, if you have a typo on your CV, you're not getting through. And if the DEI folks want to start skirting that or laxing those red flags, when that CV comes across the desk, it's getting rejected, and that candidate's going to stand out as somebody that doesn't pay attention to detail. Why? Because finding exceptional talent is very, very difficult, and you need to be very stringent and tight about your recruitment process. You cast the widest net possible, and you cherry pick only the best. Typically, when you come across an exceptional candidate, they'll have multiple offers. Why is that? That's because people generally recognize competency and hustle. We looked for PhDs, poor, hungry, and determined. That's what we looked for. So that goes to that IB reject theory. People who rejected, didn't get an offer from an investment bank that they did a summer program with, they had to hustle extremely hard to get into that program. And not everybody's going to get a job offer. So those are the people that we want to talk to. They've kind of already self-selected themselves. Equality of outcome, which is what the DEI folks are pushing for, is damaging to companies, shareholders, and the people it purports to protect by claiming we should hire or promote based on criteria other than competency and merit. And I have news for the DEI folks. People on high-performing teams recognize competency. It is not subjective. It is objective, and incompetency stands out like a sore thumb. And when you introduce an incompetent person to a high-performing team, it can cripple them. And I've had that happen before in a certain geography where we were learning that just because a person comes across quite talented doesn't necessarily mean that they're what they say on the tin. And that can cripple a team. It's very, very important then that you get rid of incompetency. And guess what? Then you're stuck with a 6-month process, documentation process with HR, and it takes a very long time. So you want to avoid incompetent people like the plague. So there's this notion that you'll hear DEI people talk about, this unconscious bias. Well, guess what? Everybody has biases, whether they're conscious or unconscious. This is something that cannot be measured, can't be quantified. It's a weak criteria that means very little. You know, when you travel around and you live and work and study in different geographies, you realize how ridiculous some of the stuff coming out of their mouths is. For example, you have this notion where if you look at somebody from a different race and you confuse two people, it's a microaggression and you're an evil racist. Well, I'll tell you a little story. When I started in Hong Kong, the person who was my main contact I was introduced to, and he came over to my desk and we shook hands and he went around the corner. Well, I went to go talk to him. I walk around the corner and there's about 50 desks and I'm looking across and I can't recognize him because I can't tell what he looks like. So he notices and he came up. I could tell this is a really genuinely nice human being. And I said, I'm sorry, man, I couldn't recognize him. He grabbed me. He's like, listen, man, you white people, you will all look the same too. And that's the reality. When you're a white person in Asia, you look like that guy from Friends. And it doesn't matter which guy from Friends, that's who you look like. So these are things that, other cultures will laugh about or poke fun at because that's the reality. There's actually been academic studies as to why that people from your own race, you're able to identify them better than other races. But the DEI folks want to turn that into something called a microaggression and make everyone's lives difficult. So this is a picture, great picture I took in North Korea. If you pick one of these lads right now and with your eyeball on it, and I move this away, and all those gentlemen were in a room, you probably wouldn't be able to figure out which one it was. So diversity damages shareholders because DEI policies police outcome and interfere with high-performing teams by suggesting that we should consider anything except talent. And what will happen in organizations like that, mediocre talent will gravitate to those environments where promotions, hiring take place using quotas, because then they don't have to hustle, while the exceptional talent will avoid environments like the plague where they promote on criteria other than competency. So when you start to toe the DEI line and start to throw up those charts that show the racial breakdowns of your organization, that's a big red flag for exceptionally talented individuals, because it doesn't allow hiring managers to promote and hire and create and manage high-performing teams. So just to conclude, DEI is applied inconsistently. It's interpreted differently by everyone. It's impossible to quantify, and it's never-ending busy work for fraudsters and charlatans. If you're somebody who believes this bullshit, you're a charlatan. If you're somebody who doesn't and you push it down our throats as hiring managers, you're a fraudster, and you have no room in any organization to add any sort of value, because fundamentally your entire process criteria, everything about what you're trying to do, damages the organization, the people you purport to protect, the employees of a company, shareholders, everybody. So what can you do to stop this? Well, you can start by asking questions. That's very important. In a public forum, start raising some of the questions that we talked about during this presentation. Why do you bucket 60% of the world into a category called Asian and then post that on charts as if it means anything? There's so many problems with DEI that we've only touched the tip of this iceberg when it comes to the damage that DEI can do to an organization. So please put your comments in the comment section. Make sure to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for taking the time to watch this today.